Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, and weird history. And our topic today is probably one of the weirdest I have ever come across. And we luckily have an absolutely wonderful guest, Dr. Brian Bixby, a professional historian who is also a relative of mine. So we've had my mom on the podcast, and now we have my Uncle Brian. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here, Taya.
Thanks for making time. So, Dr. Bixby, I call him Uncle Brian, but we will call him Dr. Bixby. He teaches at Cambridge Center for Adult Education and generally about whatever he's currently fascinated by or what his students are interested in. And he's taught on everything from the history of pirates to the history of the United States Supreme Court, including advice on how to read a court's decision. So, Dr. Uncle Brian, as we will call you in the episode, thank you so much for coming. Today, we are going to be talking about phrenomagnetism. What is phrenomagnetism?
Well, it's the 19th century version of mind control. Phreno comes from a Greek word for mind, and magnetism, you know what that is. Phrenomagnetism is the science of magnetizing your mind.
So, like, your head is going to point north and pick up iron objects or something like that? Or
No, TK. Nothing like that. No. With phrenomagnetism, an operator could control his or her subject's mind with magnetism. At least they thought they could. Why they thought that is a very long story.
Okay, and that's what you're here to tell us about today.
Indeed. So let me tell you a little bit about how phrenomagnetism came to be. The story begins in the 18th century in Vienna. There was a medical doctor named Gall who decided to study the human brain by studying those of mentally unusual people, like you or me, geniuses, criminals, or the insane, also like you or me. It was a sensible idea. And Gall came to the conclusion that the brain was made up of about 30 organs, the phrenological organs, each of which corresponded to a human behavioral characteristic. So, for example, there was one for the love of having and raising children, which was called the organ of philoprogenerativeness.
Right? Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah. And that was distinct from the organ of sexual attraction, which was called the organ of amativeness.
Okay.
If you want some other organs, there was the organ of combativeness, destructiveness, acquisitiveness, approbativeness, firmness, hope, benevolence, sublimity, form, size, weight, eventuality. I could go on.
Oh my gosh, so many.
Gall actually also had an organ of murder, which is something later phrenologists dropped.
Okay.
Aren't you thankful that you don't have an organ of murder?
Sometimes I feel like I still have that organ of murder, especially when I'm in traffic.
I think I can sympathize. Well, Gall never came to the United States. He never got any further than Paris, where he had to go because phrenology was considered to be a radical science. And it was associated with revolutionary France and things like that. He had a follower with the resounding name of Johann Gaspar Spurzheim.
Wow.
And Spurzheim took Gall's theory and added more to it. He said that bigger organs meant that you had more of the characteristic, and that by examining the shape of the skull, you could determine which organs were bigger or smaller than average, and therefore whether you had more or less of any given characteristic. Wow. It was the mental version of mine's bigger than yours. Spurzheim came to the United States to lecture in 1832, where he was celebrated as intellectual and a scientist, gave several lectures, and then incontinently dropped dead. Whereupon he was then proclaimed as a martyr to science, and there is a huge memorial for him in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. It's almost the first thing you see when you come into the cemetery.
What? Why? I don't understand. How is he so successful? What warranted him getting a giant statue in Cambridge?
Well, phrenology wasn't just reading bumps or the shape of your skull. Say you wanted to hire somebody for a job. Did the shape of their skull indicate that they were going to be diligent and reliable? Or were they going to be shiftless layabouts? That's one way it's important.
Got
Or
it.
say you were thinking about marrying someone. We try not to think of these things. But did that person have a skull that indicated that they would be faithful to you and happy to have children with you? You could find out. Phrenology, just from those two examples, is clearly the key to a well-ordered life, TK. You should try it. You should get your head examined. It was great, except for one problem.
What was that problem?
Well, it was static. There didn't seem to be any way to improve yourself.
Oh.
And when Spurzheim was talking to Americans in the 1830s, America was a place where everything was changing, new opportunities were arising, and people hoped to become better. But phrenology, once you got a reading, that was it. Your character was set. It was worse than Calvinism. You could do nothing about it. You were doomed to whatever your character was.
Oh no.
Well, Americans being Americans, another mental science came to America to provide the solution. And that was the science called animal magnetism.
So animals are now magnetically attracted to each other?
Well, have you ever lived on a farm? But no, that's not what we're talking about here. We are not talking, shall we say, dating here. The idea was that all living creatures had a magnetic fluid running through their bodies. That disturbances in the flow is what caused illnesses. And that a skilled operator, by helping the subject to restore the proper flow of magnetic fluid through their body, could actually help sick individuals become healthy again.
What?
Yes. The idea had been pioneered first by a Dr. Hell, who was
Great
actually
name.
primarily, he was primarily a philologist, a person who studies language, but he got involved in this somehow or another.
Yeah.
And he passed along his information to another doctor named Franz Anton Mesmer, which is why we sometimes call this sort of thing mesmerism. And Mesmer took this idea and ran with it. And what he would do is he would set up these huge stage performances where people would gather around a tub of magnetized water with magnetized iron rods. And he'd be in this purple taffeta robe. And he would encourage them to feel the animal magnetic fluid flowing through them. And after several minutes of this, some people would break out in hysterical fits and have to be carried off.
What?
And
God.
they would come away from this feeling so much better, because who doesn't feel better after having a hysterical fit?
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna have any fit, might as well be hysteria around a magnetized water and in front of a man in a purple robe.
It set Paris ablaze. Everyone had to go see this. Finally, the crown stepped in and said, we're dispatching a committee to check into this. And one of the people they invited on the committee was Benjamin Franklin, who was living in Paris.
No. What?
Yeah. So Ben was part of this. Now, they couldn't get Mesmer to cooperate. So they got one of his
Okay.
disciples, a fellow named Deslon. And they did this inquiry, and they decided it's all a fraud. The animal magnetic fluid does not exist. But some of them said, if it doesn't exist, how is Mesmer helping people? What's actually going on? Now, Mesmer, he ran this thing sort of as he was a doctor and he was a healer, but he also wanted to make a lot of money. So he initiated people into his methods, but they had to keep them secrets. And it was like there was a secret lodge. So he had a number of followers. And even after the unfavorable royal report, many of his followers continued his work. In the year 1835, one of his followers, a man named Charles Twain, who claimed to be descended from nobility and have a plantation in the West Indies, but probably was making it all up, came to the United States and started spreading the gospel of animal magnetism. And like Spurzheim, he came to New England, to the Boston area first. And once again, he was enormously successful. Now, animal magnetism in Poyen's hands was truly remarkable. He
Mm,
could throw people into a trance and he could make them insensible so they couldn't hear or see anything. Or he could make them think that a lemon was like a peach. Things that stage magicians do these days with hypnotism.
yeah.
But, but this isn't all he could do. Remember, it's the animal magnetic fluids flowing through all of us. Do,
Ooh.
do you feel them, TK?
I don't want to feel them.
Well, with Poyen magnetizing you, you could not only feel the fluids flowing through your body if you were a good subject, you could feel the fluids flowing through other people's bodies. You could look into their bodies and you could see how the flow was disturbed, and you
Oh my
could
God.
diagnose what was wrong with them, and you could prescribe a cure. And this, even if you didn't know anything at all about anatomy, it was like becoming a doctor in 5 minutes.
What? What? Okay, first of all, I hate the word fluid now. And also, that's insane. And people actually believe this?
He demonstrated it right in
That,
front of them.
oh
That
my
wasn't all he
gosh.
demonstrated.
Yeah.
He would take a subject who was illiterate, he would magnetize them, he would hold a newspaper behind their head, and they would read the newspaper.
Wow.
And then, most amazing of all, at least to
Mhm.
contemporaries, he could make his subjects get somehow or another come out of their bodies and go somewhere else and walk around a neighborhood they never visited and describe it.
Like astral projection kind of a thing?
Exactly.
Whoa.
At one time in Boston, he demonstrated this to a visitor from New York. He had his Boston subject walk around the visitor's New York neighborhood, New York City neighborhood. It's 196 miles away. But when you're a subject of Charles Poyen's animal magnetism, you can do this.
Wow. Wow. That's wild. Okay. So after this point, how did he start making money? Like, what is he doing now with his animal magnetism?
Well, he didn't actually know how to make money with it.
Okay.
He tried to up his prestige. This is when he claimed that he was noble and he added a title to his name. He was Chevalier. There was a guy who was making money off phrenology, though. With
Okay.
Spurzheim dead, there was no leading phrenologist in the United States until a fellow named Orson Squire Fowler, who
Okay.
was an Amherst College graduate, founded a firm in New York City to read people's heads and give them their
Okay.
phrenological readings. And he started a monthly periodical, a newsletter, and he became the central clearinghouse for all the phrenologists in this country, in the United States. So he was making money at phrenology, but there was nobody of equivalent stature on the animal magnetism side. And Poyen was doing
Okay.
so poorly at it that he went back to France. He was going to try to collect some more ideas and then come back to the United States, but he
Hmm.
died before he could.
Oh no.
So it wasn't him, and it wasn't Fowler, who then took the next step. And this is where phrenomagnetism comes from.
Okay.
Somebody got the idea that if you could use the magnetic fluid to magnetize the individual phrenological organs, that you could
Okay.
alter people's behavior.
Oh.
So I could magnetize your organ of veneration, and you would
Uh-huh.
suddenly really be interested in worshiping and being religious.
It's
Or let's just say you're one of these people that spends money like there's no tomorrow.
uh-huh.
I could magnetize you said yes far too quickly to that one,
Yeah,
TK.
I do. I spend money a little bit too much. So if you could phrenologize me, that'd be great.
If I could magnetize your organ of acquisitiveness, you would cease to spend money. You would be trying to get as much money as possible.
What? Okay, who is this person and how do I contact him?
Well, as it so happens in those days, several people came up with the idea at about the same time.
Mhm.
And they would quarrel bitterly in the press for years thereafter who discovered it first. There was a doctor, a lawyer, a preacher, and a man who, well, let's just say He knew how to make a buck. He had a good organ of acquisitiveness. The doctor was one Dr. Joseph Rhodes Buchanan,
Ooh,
who lived out in Kentucky and practiced what was called eclectic medicine, which is
okay.
to say he tried any medical procedure, any medical suggestions that came along to see if they worked.
Oh my gosh.
Phrenomagnetism was just one of the things he adopted to see if he could make it work. The lawyer was named J. Stanley Grimes. He was a child of immigrants who'd come to Boston, and like the legendary son of immigrants, he made good. He became a lawyer. He had a successful practice in Boston and New York, and he also taught jurisprudence at a medical school. And this is where he found out about animal magnetism and phrenology. Grimes was the sort of man who liked to theorize about everything, even when he didn't know what he was talking about. So phrenomagnetism was made for him.
It really was.
You're having second thoughts about this now, TK?
I think we maybe need to cut this interview a little bit short. No, just kidding.
Then there's the preacher, Leroy Sunderland, a passionate man who was into all sorts of causes, whether it was freeing slaves or attacking Mormons, who he regarded as infidels. He was so strong an abolitionist that he actually split the Methodist Church of the United States into pro and anti-abolitionist factions.
Wow.
And he was fascinated with phrenology and animal magnetism because his big concern in life was trying to understand how you influence people, how you persuade them, how you can get them to join your religious faith, how you can make them morally good people. It's an important question.
Yeah.
Now, the final one of our four phrenomagnetists, he was not a morally good person. His name is Robert Hannum Collier. Americans thought of him as British. The British thought of him as an American, which tells you something about him.
Yeah.
He was actually born in the Channel Islands off the coast of Normandy, but he went back and forth between Britain and the United States an awful lot. He lectured on whatever paid, and he found that lecturing on phrenology and animal magnetism paid very well. And to give himself credibility, he enrolled in a one-year degree program to become a medical doctor.
What?
Yeah, 1 year.
1 year. I feel like that's not even enough time to learn how to give like a vaccine or something like that. Like you need some time.
It will not surprise you to know that the medical school that he got the degree from doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. Not surprised at all.
But he is now Dr. Collier. Remember that.
All right.
Now, all four of these gentlemen, I guess you could call them, seem to have figured out how to combine phrenology and animal magnetism in the year 1841. They were able to show if you magnetized a phrenological organ, a person's character would change appropriately. And so, in effect, they had results that today, even with microsurgery, we can't do. This phrenomagnetism was a triumph of psychology and mental science.
But, and this is a big but, it seems like.
Yes, a very, very big but. There were some problems.
Okay.
It seems that you might be able to misuse phrenomagnetism.
What?
For example, one phrenomagnetist magnetized a man's organ of destructiveness, not the
Oh
organ
my
you're
goodness.
thinking.
Oh, okay. Not that kind of show.
Yeah. He magnetized a man's organ of destructiveness, and the man went on a rampage, busting up all the furniture and attacking all the people that were in the same room with him before they could demagnetize it.
Oh my goodness.
And then another case, another subject, a 13-year-old girl was magnetized into wanting stimulants. She demanded an enormous quantity of brandy to drink.
What?
And yeah, that's what she had been magnetized into wanting.
Wow.
I
So
am amazed.
weird.
Yeah, I'm amazed it was brandy specifically. I mean, rum would have been much more popular in the United States in those days.
She is high class stimulants only. That's
Yeah.
insane. 13 years old. Oh my gosh.
The magnetizer told her he didn't have that much brandy. And she gave him an ill look and she said, "Go out and steal it then."
What?
And when he said he would not go and steal it, she threatened to kill him.
Good Lord. Apparently her destructive organ was also enlarged as well as her stimulant seeking organ. What? That is so wild. Why would this magnetizer do something like this?
He was trying to see how it worked. There were actual
Whoa,
phrenomagnetic clubs set up where people tried these types of experiments.
my gosh.
But there was one experiment no one dared try, at least not on
Okay.
record. No one tried magnetizing the organ of amativeness.
Okay.
And there's a good reason for this. People were noticing something a little gamey about the whole business. It
Mm-hmm.
seemed like phrenomagnetists were men, and
Mm,
most of their subjects were women, including young
mm,
women. Might it just be possible that the phrenomagnetists were using their power to try to seduce women?
ugh.
It seemed far too likely. Indeed, an anonymous pamphlet, Confessions of a Magnetizer, came out that accused a leading phrenomagnetist, not named, but said to be a divorced minister who had remarried, of having seduced his second wife into marriage this way. Now, as it turns out, there was one phrenomagnetist who fit this description to a T, Reverend Leroy Sunderland. He was flabbergasted. This was defamation of character. It threatened to derail his career as a minister. So he published another pamphlet fervently denying the charge.
Mm,
But he could stop people from being suspicious. Now, Dr.
mm.
Collier, may have been a
Yes.
bit of a con, yeah, he may have been a bit of a con man, but
Okay.
he was an intelligent man. And he realized the way you get rid of a charge like this is not, you just don't deny it, you deflect.
Okay.
So what he did was he published a story about a case he said he had. He said he once had a patient, a young woman, who had fallen in love with the wrong type of man,
Mm.
a man who had abandoned her. And she was now pining after him with no hope of ever seeing him again. Her mother brought her to see Dr. Collier, saying, "Is there something you can do for my daughter?"
Okay.
Collier magnetized her and told her to forget everything about this young man altogether.
What?
And then he unmagnetized her. And she woke up and she was no longer depressed because she didn't remember anything about the guy. She didn't remember
What?
if she had, yeah, he erased her memory of this man completely.
Wild. I would like
Apparently,
that from time to time.
apparently nobody thought much about this in 1842. It is pretty creepy when you think about it.
It's incredibly creepy because, there's all those movies and stuff. I think the one that comes to my mind the quickest is Men in Black, where they have that stick that they
Neutralizer, yes.
the neutralizer, exactly. It's like the neutralizer, and that always really scared me as a kid because I thought, "What if somebody neutralizes me and then I forget all of the embarrassing things that I do, but everybody else remembers?" Which would be horrible. So this creepy, creepy cure happens, and then what next?
Well, Collier published it, and this basically protected him from any accusations that he was seducing women this way, which actually, considering what happened to him later in his life, is pretty ironic, but we'll get into that later.
Okay.
Now, Collier, as I say, was an intelligent man, even if he was a bit of a con man. And he was the one that eventually figured out that phrenomagnetism didn't actually work as advertised.
Wow. Surprise, surprise.
What happened was that he accidentally told somebody that he transposed two organs by accident verbally. Like he said he was magnetizing the organ of veneration when he was supposed to be magnetizing the organ of acquisitiveness. And yet the patient responded as if he was actually magnetizing the organ of veneration.
Okay.
Now, it could be that Collier was really intelligent and made this experiment deliberately, but the likely story is he screwed up and did it
Yeah.
accidentally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he started trying doing it. He found he could transpose any two organs. In fact, he found he could tell people that their phrenological organs were in their elbow and affect their personality that way.
Wow. Wow.
And so he realized that as far as phrenomagnetism went, the phrenological organs were irrelevant. Either they didn't exist or they had no effect on what he was doing. The animal magnetism was what was powerful.
Okay.
He published this conclusion and immediately got into a fight with all the other phrenomagnetists. They all hated each other. They all needed to have their organ of their organ of adhesiveness, of friendliness, magnetized. They were all very, very jealous people. But all the other ones quickly came to the realization that Collier was right. So by 1845, phrenomagnetism, having only been around for 4 years, was already dead.
So there's no chance of me changing my personality at all?
Well, not with phrenomagnetism. And you should probably not be too unhappy about this, because it turns out that both of the theories behind these two sciences were completely wrong. In the 1860s, a French scientist named Broca discovered an organ that existed on only one side of the brain that was involved speech and had nothing to do with the phrenological organs. And that was the start of taking phrenology apart for good. The magnetic fluid was never detected because it didn't exist. A weird coincidence, about the same time phrenomagnetism was falling apart, a Scottish physician named James Braid studied the matter and decided that what people were thinking of as a magnetic fluid was actually just the results of psychological suggestibility. And he called what happened hypnosis.
Oh, okay. So this is where hypnosis comes from.
Yes. Although, you mentioned Men in Black, but you'll see hypnosis in a lot of movies and TV programs. And a lot of the time owes a lot more to the way animal magnetism supposedly worked than the way hypnotism is actually used by doctors now. You get the idea of an evil hypnotist who has the willpower to overwhelm your mind and make you do things.
Yeah.
And a lot of that traces to a late Victorian novel called Trilby by George du Maurier, where the evil Bengali turns Trilby into an opera singer.
Oh my gosh, it's always the Victorians. They're the creepiest humans ever in the whole world. Oh my gosh.
So that's really what the hypnotism you see in the movies and TV is really more what animal magnetism was supposed to be, minus the I'm going to look at the magnetic currents in your body and tell you what's wrong with your health. But it's a lot about this dominating minds. There's a Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movie. I think it's The Woman in Green, in which this explanation is used to explain why the woman can hypnotize poor Dr. Watson, but not Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes has an iron will, whereas Dr. Watson
is more impressionable. Got it. Yeah. So what happened to all of the phrenomagnetists when they learned it didn't really work?
Well, you might say each of them went to their just desserts. So let's start with Dr. Buchanan. He kept trying out new ideas, and in fact, he invented an idea and coined a name for it: psychometry. The idea that you could touch an object and read its history just from touching it. So that you could, if I held this walking stick in my hands, I could tell you where it came from and who turned it into a walking stick.
Oh.
The answer, incidentally, is your it's your 3 greats grandfather who did this.
Oh, okay. So you do have this psychochemic ability.
No, I was just told.
No, you're just a family historian. That's what it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is way cooler than psychochemistry.
So Buchanan went over to what was called spiritualism in the late 1840s, this idea that we could talk to the spirit world through seances and things like that. And he brought psychometry with them, which is why seance mediums often claim they can tell the history of something by touching it.
Okay.
And in fact, Buchanan's second wife, who's also buried here in Boston, was both a spiritualist and a psychometrist. J. Stanley Grimes continued to invent new theories about things he didn't understand. He actually came up with the idea of biological evolution a decade before Darwin, but it was connected to these weird theories about how the human brain resembles the Earth's geology.
Okay.
So nobody
What?
paid any attention. Yeah, everyone ignored it. Like they ignored everything else.
They're like, "Oh, Stanley, just go away."
Pretty much. Leroy Sunderland, like Dr.
Mhm.
Buchanan, also became a
Mhm.
spiritual. But in the end, he decided that phrenology, animal magnetism, phrenomagnetism, and most religious phenomena he'd seen all were just based in mundane psychology. That's really how you persuade people. And that's what Sunderland had always wanted to know. So while he didn't like the answer he got, at least he did get the answer to his life's quest. He understood how you
Mhm.
persuade people to do things. And finally, Collier, the man who always knew how to make a buck. He first he first tried to turn phrenomagnetism into what he called psychography, the idea that you could mentally project images from one mind to another.
Oh
And he
my
once
gosh.
conducted an experiment where he projected an image into a bowl of molasses so that it would actually be read by somebody else who was at the same angle because it was like a physical force, the image going into the
Oh,
molasses and coming out again.
why molasses? What conductive agent is molasses?
I guess it's reflective. I really don't, Collier does not explain that. He just
Okay.
says it could be done. He got into other things. He lectured in whatever made money. At one point, he did
Mhm.
a tour of artist models across the country
Mhm.
and got kicked out of a few cities because supposedly some of the models were appearing nude, including
Okay.
his second wife, who he may have married without divorcing his first one.
Oh my gosh.
He went during the California gold rush. He went and panned for gold in California.
Mhm.
He filed patents for a number of inventions that nobody ever seems to have used. And he was accepted as a legitimate scientist when the Royal Anthropological Institute in London was started up. I've read some of their transcripts. It's amusing to see them look at him as if he's a legitimate scientist.
What the heck? What was going on there at the Anthropological Institute in London? What were they smoking? What's going on?
He did actually have a valued relic, something called the foxhole jaw, which he had bought off
Okay.
somebody. And for years after he disappeared, anthropologists were looking for the foxhole jaw. There were inquiries sent out for decades afterwards, but
What?
it's never reappeared. To put this in perspective, during all these years, Collier was accused of fornication, adultery, bigamy, sodomy, and not paying his debts.
Wow, what a guy. What a guy.
At least one of his marriages was annulled when evidence of one of his previous marriages finally turned up. There are at least two other women who are listed as his wife at different times, for which we have no marriage ceremonies. And despite all this, he ultimately vanishes into obscurity. And what we're not sure, he may have died in New Orleans in 1891, but there's no death certificate or grave. Sunderland was already dead by this point. He died a few years
Uh-huh.
earlier. But Grimes and Buchanan would live on for about another decade. Grimes would die in 1903, and with his death, pretty much ends the history of the Phrenomagnetists. With
Mm,
one amusing footnote.
okay.
Grimes had bought an insurance policy for a life insurance policy for $4,000. And in the 1870s, he converted it to an annuity policy that paid him $400 a year.
Okay.
So by the time he died, he'd actually collected over $10,000 off of this policy.
Oh my gosh. So he benefited like twice the amount of money in his life than his death. That, oh my gosh,
for,
forever a con artist.
for once, Grimes had a good idea.
Yeah. Holy cow. Wow.
And that's the story of the Phrenomagnetists.
That was an absolute roller coaster ride of just so many things. So these people, I thought you were gonna eventually say, like, these were paid actors or something like that, like so many seances were. But it just seems like people were so impressionable. And I wanna, people always wanna say, oh, it was because it was in the past and people in the past aren't that smart. But that's not true. We've got people here now that do hypnotism shows, and people get hypnotized all the time for things like smoking is a really big one, I think.
Mm.
And that happens all the time. So these probably were not paid actors. They were real people being really impressioned by this.
Well, here's an example of somebody you may have heard of, Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Mark Twain both visited a phrenologist and was once hypnotized, whatever you want to call it. There was both a phrenologist and a mesmerizer came to Hannibal, Missouri, where he lived when he was a kid. He didn't see the phrenologist at the time, but the mesmerizer was having a multi-day show, and he was so desperate to be a subject that he watched the other people who the mesmerizer was magnetizing. And on the fourth day, he went up there and imitated them, and he managed to get selected.
Oh my gosh.
He says he faked the whole thing. Years later, Twain was in London, and at the time, I mentioned Orson Squire Fowler as the chief phrenologist. Fowler had a brother, Lorenzo Niles Fowler, who spent a few decades living in London and was doing phrenology there. Twain went to see Lorenzo Niles Fowler, but the first time he did so incognito. He dressed up as a undistinguished gentleman and went to see Fowler. And then a few weeks later, he went back as Mark Twain, who was already famous in England at that time. And he got completely different readings from Fowler.
Oh my gosh, what a con artist! Holy cow.
Fowler, one of the first things Fowler told him the first time around was that he was really courageous, which even Twain couldn't swallow that. And he must have reacted because then Fowler knew, oh, you also have a huge bump of cautiousness, and that negates the courage.
Yeah. Okay.
But he told Twain, you have no bump of humor whatsoever. When Twain went back the second time as Mark Twain, Fowler said, you have a mountain, an Everest of humor on your head.
Oh my God. Which one is true? Depends on how you feel about Mark Twain, I guess.
And the other gotcha for this one is we don't know whether Twain is pulling our leg or not about this. He didn't tell this story until about 30 years later.
Okay.
And he's actually, he says he repeated in real life what another American author, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., wrote about in a book called The Professor at the Breakfast Table, where he has a literary character do this.
Okay.
So is Twain telling the truth, or did he just rip off a friend of his, a story friend?
I mean, if he did that, it would be pretty par for the course for his character as a person.
Not everybody accepted this. Some people did. This story about the subject who walked a neighborhood in New York while sitting in Boston, that was told to Colonel Stone, who was a prominent publisher in New York at the time, and Stone bought it. This is a fellow named William Leete Stone. He was always called Colonel Stone. Stone bought it. But not all New Yorkers did. There was a scientist, a genuine scientist, named Charles Durant, who lived in New York. He was famous for being a balloonist. He'd gone up in balloons in the United States something like 13 times. He was the preeminent balloonist of his era. The only reason he stopped was because he got married and his wife thought it was too dangerous. He read Twain's book about what Twain was doing with animal magnetism. And he said, the experiments that Twain is doing aren't up to my scientific standards. I will set up real scientific experiments.
Okay.
So he did, and he was able to conclusively prove that the animal magnetic fluid could not exist the way Twain described it. He had just as much success as the French Royal Commission with Franklin that exposed mesmer.
Oh,
nobody paid any attention.
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's more fun to believe something like this than it is to believe that it's not real. Yeah. Oh my goodness. That happens, you see it a lot today with social media. Like people want to believe the ancient aliens, built the pyramids, and they want to believe that the mountain, the plateaus in the Andes are actually big, giant tree stumps, things, crazy, crazy things like that. Because it's more fun, but it's because they don't know the real history and the real science behind it, which is always way more fun and way more exciting than than anything anybody could make up.
Yes. No one would make up phrenomagnetism.
No one would make that up. That is so wild. So when they did the phrenology, the measuring of your bumps on your different brain organs, I think I have seen floating around the internet a picture of the machine or one of the machines that was used. Like it's like got all these kind of like twist down dials to take the measurements, or is that completely wrong? How did they measure the bumps on the brain or on the skull?
Well, the initial measurements were done pretty much visually and by touch, but they used calipers, individual ones for different places. A British
Mm,
phrenologist named George Combe worked out the best ways to do this. What you're
okay.
seeing is what you were talking about is something that happens later. Phrenology, even though it's gradually discredited, its ideas pass over into anthropology, and it's used to try to justify racism by saying if you take the right measurements, you can prove that Caucasians are superior to the other races or things like that.
Ugh. Oh my god.
And
Okay.
and they would do these measurements on people's skulls and say, "Oh, here's the proof." Now, of course, anytime you end up with a result that doesn't work properly, you say, "Oh, well, that's
Mhm.
obviously an exception."
Yeah, an outlier or something like that. Yeah.
This was one of the criticisms that even in their day people had of the phrenologists is they were guilty of what's called confirmation bias. They
Mm,
tended to accept the results that back their theory and ignore the ones that didn't. Buchanan was unfortunately notorious for falling victim to confirmation bias
mm.
in his medical practice. If he saw things that worked, he continued to use them even if there were times they didn't work.
Wow.
Uh,
That Buchanan guy really just not a lot going on upstairs.
and yet he's the only one of these. He's the only one of these four phrenomagnetism of whom there's actually a biography written. Um,
Really? Oh my gosh. That's just one of those, I feel like one of those historical moments where it's just by luck and chance and happenstance, that person gets more recognition. Just like King Tut wasn't that
mm,
impressive of a pharaoh, but everybody knows who he is, kind of a thing.
yeah, Buchanan was a proper medical doctor, unlike Collier. Out in what was then the western part of the United States at the time, there weren't that many doctors, so
Mhm.
he played an influential role in medical practice in those days out in that part of the country, which is
Mm.
one reason why he's remembered. Leroy Sunderland is remembered primarily because he wrote a tract attacking the Mormons, and so the Mormons all remember him. Not on
Got it. Okay.
Grimes. Nobody remembers Grimes.
Poor Grimes.
And Collier. Well, there's the only thing that keeps Collier's memory alive is that there's another Robert Collier about 50 years later who's actually a minister who's often
Mm.
confused with him.
Oh no. Poor minister.
Yeah. So
Oh my goodness. Well, Dr. Uncle Brian, this was a fascinating, weird dive into a topic that we have never talked about before here on the podcast. I would love to say that I loved learning about this, which I did, but it was also weird.
yes, it was a hoot.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, and at the same time, if you know what was going on in the United States at the time, people wanted to be able to find ways to improve themselves, and they tried.
Yeah.
Sunderland was influenced by Sylvester Graham, the graham
Mhm.
cracker. Graham was a dietary reformer, and he believed sensibly that what you ate affected what you thought and felt.
Yeah.
So, and Sunderland was interested in this because, again, this is about how you persuade people to think differently. If you get them
Yeah.
to eat the right foods.
Then you can change them. There was another guy, the guy who created Frosted Flakes, right? Wanted to
Yes,
change behavior by eating horrible, disgusting, bland not frosted, but just flakes.
Yeah, breakfast cereal is a mind control experiment.
I don't know. Captain Crunch can control my mind sometimes. I love that stuff. Oh my gosh. Well, Uncle Brian, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. Please tell everybody, do you have any books out, anything that you're promoting right now? If people would like to hear more from you, is there any place where they can find you?
Well, I do have an inactive blog, which I need to get restarted, but I will be teaching 2 courses in the spring. One is on the Electoral College, which is how Americans elect their president, a system even they don't understand.
Yeah.
And I'll be teaching online a course on French royal scandals.
Ooh.
Which involves poisoning, witchcraft, women of ill repute being mistaken for the queen, princesses being mistaken for women of ill repute, adventurers, princes, cardinals, a investigation that threatened to reach all the way to the king himself.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Well, it definitely sounds like we're going to have you on the podcast again, because I need to know all of the juicy scandals, especially with the popes. I love Catholic scandals so much.
I don't have a pope in this set, but there is a cardinal.
Close enough.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I will put all of the information for Dr. Brian Bixby, my Uncle Brian, in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming today. And I will see you, dear listener, in the outro. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, TK.
Well, dear one, thank you so much for joining me and Uncle Dr. Brian in this episode. I really enjoyed learning about this. The world is full of so many weird and wonderful things. This falls very much in the weird only and not wonderful category. And just a strange topic. And if you enjoyed learning about this strange topic, consider leaving a rating or review, or both. And if you'd like to let me know your thoughts on this episode specifically, you can use Spotify's little question and answer feature on the app, which is super duper cool. And if you'd like to support the podcast in other ways, you can head on over to Patreon, where we're doing a super cool new series each week leading up to August, which, as I'm sure you know, is spooky season in Japan. We read one story from the Tales of Moonlight and Rain, which is an excellent series of stories by Ueda Akinari, who is considered to be one of the greatest ghost story writers in Japanese literature. So each week we take a look at the history by dropping ourselves in the time period, as well as the time period in which he writes. We talk about the characters, we talk about the historical events that he weaves into the stories, and it's basically just like a little Japanese literature in Ghost Stories 101 for each episode, and it's super duper cool. So if you would like to join us over there, that would be great. We have a bunch of other goodies and history bonus thingies coming up, like the History That Ate. We're doing another live cooking show on YouTube. So if you want the ingredients list and to know about it ahead of time so you can plan and cook with me, if you join Patreon, you get access to all of that. But if that's not your thing, that's totally okay. There is the merch store, which is another great way to support the podcast. And just by you being here is also fantastic, and I appreciate it so much. Just a reminder, we are still on season break, but if you're listening to this on the day that the episode comes out, we have less than a month until season 9, and I can't wait. I am so excited. So with that, I will tell you to do something kind for yourself. Go outside, touch some grass, drink some water, and I will see you next week. Okay, talk to you later. Love you. Bye.